BUTLER to lead the panel discussion.
Thank you very much. Son, can you hear me? I practiced how to say good morning in Korean and just lost it just like that. So forgive me. Good morning to all of you, almost good afternoon. And thank you for being here today. And I hope you will enjoy the conversation that we're going to have on best practices in collective impact. So I wanted to set this slide to put us all in the same context. These basically represent the 5 elements of collective impact: common agenda, shared measurement, reinforcing activities. In other words, we all do things that reinforce the activities we do together. Continuous communication, very important. And last but not least, backbone organization, the structure that holds the collective impact initiative all together. What we'll be talking about today, what the panelists, these esteemed panelists, will be talking about today is sharing with you stories. We have someone that is Pan-Asian, so we'll have stories from a Pan-Asian perspective on collective impact. That's Colin. We have a story from Australia, which is Liz, on collective impact, particularly United Way as a backbone organization. We have Sachiko's story from Japan, talking about how cause marketing and disaster kind of comes together and results in social enterprise work. And then I wanted to say Saleem. Aaron, who, yeah, he's like Saleem light, literally. Aaron, who's substituting for Saleem, will share with us actually 2 stories on collective impact. One from the United States, from Cincinnati, Ohio, and one from India. So with that, I've asked each panelist, before they do their presentation, to share with you the one thing that they would like you to take away from their presentations. So I'm going to do it in the order of your presentations. So we'll start with Aaron.
Thank you, Janet. Am I transmitting? Yes? Great. So before I share my one thing, I just wanted to send a message on behalf of our colleague Saleem Khan, the CEO of United Way of India. As you might have heard in the news, there were some devastating floods that struck the southern part of India earlier this month, and it's resulted in the loss of almost 400 lives. Nearly 1 million people have been displaced, and United Way of India, along with some of the local United Ways, including United Way of Chennai, have been actively involved in supporting the immediate relief efforts. So this week, our colleague Saleem is actually on the ground in those impacted communities, gathering information that will help them decide how they can support now the medium to long-term rehabilitation and rebuilding of those communities. So it's an honor to fill in on his behalf, and he sends both his apologies and his regards to all of you. So having said that, my one thing, I actually have 3 things, but I've wrapped it into one. And I usually think in 3. So I have 3 things, and those I call them the 3 Ps. So I would say, as it relates to collective impact in the context of the United Way network, number 1, you certainly have to have patience. It can take as many as 3 years before you start to see the results of your efforts. Number 2, you have to have, and this is in very practical terms, really sound project management. Janet referred to the backbone a moment ago. For me, that means really good project management. And then thirdly, you have to believe that social change is possible. So you have to keep the faith and believe. And so those are my 3.
Thank you, Aaron. Okay. Colin, who just literally flew in this morning to be with us, and we're very, very grateful that he was able to join us. Colin, what is your one thing?
Thank you, Janet. I'll try and wrap 5 things into one thing. Actually, no, there's only one thing that I'd like you to take away. I feel a bit of a fraud sitting up here because I'm from a sports organization, and it's not a charitable organization. It doesn't say on my badge here somewhere. It says AFC, which, and not one of those words is anything to do with charity. It's the Asian Football Confederation. But what I would like you to take away is the positive power of sport and the way that sport can influence people's lives and the way that it can touch people's lives and the way that it can be a conduit for many things other than just physical education, particularly health, well-being, education, integrity, all those sort of things. So that's the one thing, the positive power of sport.
Thank you, Colin. Now, you said you don't like, Elizabeth sounds very formal, so Liz.
Yes, thank you.
Who is,
Only Elizabeth when I'm in trouble on the panel, okay, so.
and Liz is the board chair for United Way Australia, and actually for me is a model volunteer leader.
Oh.
So we're happy you're here with us today.
Thank you.
So Liz,
Thank you
what
very
is
much.
what is your one
Yeah.
thing?
Look, I think the key, having been involved in a collective impact project now for 3 years, for me is to keep that undying focus on the community voice, because truly collective impact is an art, not a science. And when you lose the community voice as you're managing diverse stakeholders with different interests, you can go off the path, which really is there to boost and build a deep community engagement and systems change at a community level. So for me, that has to be your Northern Star, and holding on to it. The rest is the art around it of managing stakeholders, and that's what United Way, I think, is really there to do as a backbone. Thanks.
Thank you, Liz. And Sachiko-san.
Does this just work? Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, one message is a very difficult homework that was given to us just last night. But I think selecting good partners, having faith in them, respecting them, having a good trusting relationship, and the flexibility to accommodate what the changing needs are, and working together leads to great collaboration, which leads to great results.
Thank you very much. Please clap for my esteemed panelists. Clap for me. Yeah. Jose has visited me in Ghana, and in Ghana we say, clap for me. So, all right. So with that, Aaron will go first. Thank you.
Super. Thank you, Janet. So I think I followed Hank's suggestion here in clicking some of the buttons I'm not supposed to. So let me go back.
There we
Great.
go.
So what I wanted to do is just share a couple of examples from the United Way Network. One is from the United States, and another is specific to India, yet is also happening in several other countries. And hopefully in the course of this presentation, you'll see the potential for this type of approach in your respective markets and countries. So what they have in common, these two examples from the United Way Network, is that number one, they're focused on the skills to jobs gap. In other words, closing the difference between the skills that people have vis-a-vis the job opportunities that exist in the city where they live. The common agenda is not only increasing employment, certainly from an individual perspective, but increasing the economic well-being overall of that community. And the common approach that, or strategy that they're deploying against that challenge has to do with workforce development. Finally, I wanted to tie this back to the Sustainable Development Goals, and saying the one most relevant for both of these programs has to do with the SDG on decent work and economic growth. So the first of the two examples, which comes from the US, I just wanted to give some context to this by saying that it's, in this particular case in Dallas, there was a study that was done that determined that about 42,000 early to middle level jobs needed to be filled in Dallas within the next 5 years. And as they scan the potential pool of employees, of job candidates, they realized that they didn't have the necessary skills to be able to fill those opportunities and help businesses in Dallas grow. So the employers there needed qualified workers. Certainly as nonprofits, United Way's included, we have an interest in equipping individuals with employable skills so that they can have strong income and stable families. And so hence emerged this partnership between United Way Metropolitan and Dallas, funders, employers, and then training providers. And essentially, the two sectors where there was the greatest opportunity to close this skills and job gap that I referenced earlier were information technology and healthcare. I wanted to provide some insight into who were the stakeholders in this collective impact effort and what were their roles. And really there are four. And so there were the employers, number one, the funders, the training providers, and then finally United Way. And so let me just say, obviously the problem is at the center of this diagram. It resonates very strongly with what I think you said, Liz, about you've got to keep the voice of the community and the need in focus and not get lost in the process for you to be successful. And so in this particular instance, what the employers did was they gave information about what are their projected hiring needs in these two fields specifically. And then secondly, they made a commitment to hire the employees coming through the training programs that we were working to provide with the necessary skills. Secondly, we appealed to funders, and there were multiple funders in this instance. I'll share some more information on that in just a moment. But they invested in the training organization specifically to equip the people with the necessary skills. They also invested in this backbone function, in this project management function that the United Way in this case was playing. And so what does that mean for United Way? Well, in the case of United Way, it had to do with facilitating not only setting the goals, objectives, the strategies, but also facilitating ongoing coordination and communication between all of the different groups, and then collecting and sharing data that reflects progress to the overall goal of the effort. So that was United Way's role. And then finally, we come to the training partners. And in their case, they were really trying to build people's skills for the jobs that employers in Dallas needed to fill. And we're also helping to recruit and train these new workers themselves. So that summarizes the roles. If we come now to results, the two that I would highlight that I think are very compelling have to do with the number of job placements, well over 300, successfully and gainfully employed through today. And that required an investment of $2.9 million. And then you see the number here also of not only funders, but the employers, the actual companies between healthcare and IT that actually hired these individuals that before had little to no prospect of ever working in these fields that were growing fast in Dallas and for which there was a compelling need. So that brings me to the second example. And this one takes us across the pond, if you will, into India. But first, I want to zoom out and talk about generations because it really is a bigger initiative. And the context I would provide around generations is that McKinsey has a social impact entity, if you will, within itself, and they looked at 125 education-to-work programs across 25 countries. And what they try to determine are what makes them a success, where they work and actually get people into employment, and where those people stay, not only stay in that employment, but they're successful. In other words, they grow within those jobs. What are the critical success factors? And based on that study, they came up with a design of an evidence-based program with a lot of rigor around it that could be replicated in different parts of the world. So the goal within a 5-year span, this is by 2020, is to make sure that 1 million young people are trained and placed into promising careers. It's across the 5 countries that you see listed on this slide, including India, which I'll focus on in a moment, and using this one evidence-based methodology that I mentioned a moment ago. So specifically in India, it's referred to as Generations United. It's a nice blending of United Way and Generations, again, this codified program. And what you see on the left-hand side of this slide, as I described for Dallas, it's even bigger in the case of India, and that is the demand for skilled workers and the number of jobs that are projected. In this case, by 2025, you see towards the bottom of the slide, and this is in millions. And then you see the anticipated number of workers who will have the necessary skill set to fill those jobs. A vast gap in the case of India. And so the idea, albeit a modest one in the case of Generation, is try to connect 10,000 young adults to skills and jobs in India. And as you see the cycle on the right-hand side of the skill, it goes from identifying the youth with the potential, because I'll share a bit about the profile of the target audience, to providing training. Once they get into these jobs, actual mentorship. Those are in the company and are keen to ensure that the new employees succeed in their role. And then monitoring and support, and that comes sometimes even from community-based organizations, recognizing that a company can't meet all of an employee's needs necessarily. So a lot of information on this slide, but let me just highlight a few points very quickly. So the profile in the case of India of the participants, and this is consistent with other forms of generation in other countries, is 18 to 29 years old, for the most part single, And while they might not have children, they may have dependents, whether parents or siblings or other relatives that are relying on them. And coming in, 80% of them are unemployed. They may be in the informal sector, but again, they're looking to get into a more stable job that has real great prospects as a career. You can see for the different of the three sectors in India, between healthcare, hospitality, and retail, the number of weeks of intensive training and support that the individuals receive. And then as you look all the way on the right-hand side, there's a bit of a description about the roles. And so what I would say about the roles is this varies a little bit from country to country. It's often negotiated between United Way and the other stakeholders involved in the effort. But at a high level, McKinsey is providing, number one, the methodology. They're contracting the trainers for the job training or training community-based organizations to provide the skill-based training to individuals. And then they're actually screening the young people and monitoring them once they're in the program. United Way plays an important role in recruiting them, often in partnership with its community-based organizations, and providing other complementary services that meet the needs of the employees. And that may relate to their family, to their health, or other matters. And then finally, together, this is often a joint effort, McKinsey United Way work to build relationships with the employers to get them to agree to hire the people coming through these training programs. And to raise the money and also promote it broadly. But again, that can differ from market to market. So there are lots of success stories to point to since this launched. In the case of India, it was in 2015 that this first started. It's only been more recently that they've started to do it in conjunction with United Way. So an important note here is that the McKinsey Generations United Way partnership, it's not exclusive to United Way. They are working with other organizations in these 5 countries, but we see it as a program that's strongly aligned with our work around social and economic mobility. And so the one I would highlight here, having been inspired by the one we heard earlier from the YCAB Foundation in Indonesia, is the first one here. So this is Sirvani, 25 years old, was unemployed, had children, and that precluded her from pursuing her dreams of higher education. But through this program was able to secure a job as a home care attendant, was promoted within a very short period of time, working with patients who required more attention and care, and has subsequently been promoted again as a field coordinator, now overseeing multiple home care assistants. A remarkable and powerful story, and a really good reminder of why we do this work in the first place. As you look on the right-hand side of the slide, there are some results at a really high level. I would highlight just a couple of them. In the case of India to date, 4,500 graduates, an employment rate of about 75%. But I think there's 2 other that are very compelling here. One of which is that for the individuals that go through this program, the salary that they have after they are employed is on the average 6 times higher than what they had beforehand. Now, we recognize some of them came from no employment or informal employment, but that is an enormous jump, and imagine what a difference it makes in their and their families' lives. And secondly, there was a question day one yesterday at the conference about really what's the business case for a double bottom line? How do you make the case to companies that this makes sense? And what they found is that depending on which of the 3 sectors we're talking about in the case of India, employers saw between a 0.3% and a 0.6% increase in their overall revenues as a result of hosting these employees in their company. Of course, it's more of a correlation than causation, but at the same time, it's pretty compelling evidence that this is making a difference not only to the participants, but also to the companies. And by 2018, they're hoping, I think they'll be on track to hit their mark of 10,000 employees. So the last thing I wanted to say, there's actually one more case study. So let me first ask, how many of you were at the networking dinner last night? Okay, about half the room. So for those of you who weren't, if none of these other examples made any sense to you as it relates to what collective impact was, maybe this one will. So I've called this the Have Your Cake and Eat It Too collaborative. And so what you see happening here, consistent with collective impact, is we've got a large number of people in the room. There had to be 3 times the number of people in that room as there are today. But you have this really small cake. Only the one on top was edible. So what happened is that these local, national, and worldwide organizations from 4 different countries came together to cut the cake, make everybody happy, and advance the common good. And so if that isn't collective impact, I don't know what is. But the idea is that, the whole with collective impact is always greater than the sum of the parts. So thank you for your time and attention.
Please clap for Aaron. I'm very familiar with the Generation program in Kenya, and it is a very impressive kind of demand-driven job training program. The program in Kenya is a little bit older than the one in India, and they have a very impressive placement rate of 94%. So it's a great program. As United Way, we have an MOU with McKinsey, so we're looking to, in these various countries, to figure out what value can United Way bring to scaling the Generation program across many other countries and geographies. So again, clap for Aaron. Thank you very much. So next, we're going to the world of football and sport. And, Colin will talk about the importance of sport in terms of its relationship with bringing young people, getting them interested in education, getting them motivated. And it's something I think that many of us don't often think about. In Ghana, we do a lot of work with a play soccer organization that does tremendously important work in getting kids that aren't even thinking about going to school interested in education. So I have a lot of respect for the role of sport and education. So with that, turn it over to Colin. Please clap for him.
Thank you, Janet. I think we've got a small video that we're going to show first, haven't we? Sorry, I've knocked that over. Do I have to start it?
Next slide.
Next slide. Sorry, I managed to. Which one? No. There it is. Got it. I think that video gives you a very brief overview of what the Asian Football Confederation does. As I said at the start, we are a football organization. But with football, with the development of football comes a responsibility. And that responsibility is to develop the communities in which we play our sport. As simple as that. I think we go back one step from where Aaron was. Aaron was talking about getting people into education, into business, into jobs. We're talking about helping people start their lives in a lot of cases. I'm going to rush quickly through these slides because they cover, a lot of it is covered in the video, but I want to get to one of them here, this one. This is the map of, we started our Dream Asia Foundation, of which we signed an MOU with United Way. So 2 apologies, one for knocking the water over, and the second one for that this video was made before we signed that MOU. But in the last 18 months, you can see the projects that we've carried out, vast number of projects across Asia. And it was funny, I was talking to Janet before, and I said, I think we have an Asia that nobody else recognizes, no other business recognizes. It starts in Beirut and it finishes in Brisbane. It starts in Gaza and finishes in Guam. Nobody else has a business that's like that. We have 2/3 of the world's population within our boundaries. We have 2/3 of the world's youth. We also have 3/4 of the world's mobile telephones as well. But a funny story about Bangladesh was in 2000 they had 13,000 telephones. In 2016 they had 385 million telephones, most of them mobile telephones. And so we know the way to communicate with people, and so we talked about continuous communication. And one of the great areas of development through our social responsibility has also been our social media, which now has a reach of more than 200 million people, which, as somebody pointed out to me, is 2 small provinces in China. But it's still an awful lot of people that to be communicating with. With a continent and a business this size, there comes lots of challenges, and with the challenges comes opportunities. Asia faces many of the natural and humanitarian disasters that you can imagine in the world. Most of them are based in Asia. It's funny that Aaron was saying that Saleem couldn't be here today because of the latest floods in Kerala and southern parts of India. We had been blessed, we felt, for the last couple of years, where we hadn't had a real major earthquake since 2016, or a major natural disaster since 2016, which was the earthquake in Japan. And you saw a little bit of the projects we'd done there in Kumamoto in southern Japan. So when we look at our role, the role of the Asian Football Confederation, it is to help people. Is to help people. That's what we do. And how do we do it? It's like Sachiko said before, we have smart partnerships, sensible partnerships, good partners. And what we also have to do, unfortunately in Asia, in parts of Asia, you have to have an efficient way of distributing aid. Because a lot of aid can be collected, and a lot of aid sometimes doesn't get to its end user, to the person who really needs it. So that's why we started the Dream Asia Foundation. And we quickly found that we had 2 very big partners apart from United Way Worldwide, which were the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, the UNHCR, and the International Red Cross. UNHCR is one of our biggest partners, and the reason that, and again, it was a smart partnership. Why? Because we have refugee crisis wherever you look in Asia. It's not just a lot of focus has been in West Asia. But nobody talks about the refugees from Yemen into Oman. Nobody talks about, or until recently didn't talk too much. I think I heard Kate Blanchett on the BBC World Service talking about the Rohingya people being forced out of Myanmar to go to places like Bangladesh. And one of the stories and one of the things that encourages me, and I think you always need encouragement and always need something that gives you a reason to carry on doing what you're doing, and why we feel so proud of what we're doing here. Was in Malaysia we have 150,000 refugees. Now most of the time when we go to Jordan, when we go to Lebanon, the picture actually at the start of this presentation was of a refugee camp in Jordan. And some of the refugees that you see, the girls that you saw playing football, were refugees in Lebanon. They came from Syria, and they came from the latest wars in that region. But they're in camps. In Malaysia, we have 150,000 refugees, and there is no camp. There is no camp. There's not one refugee camp in Malaysia. These are urban refugees. These are people living in broken shops, old petrol stations, derelict houses, on fields, in jungles. These are people that are very hard to track. So why are we so proud of what we've done with UNHCR in Malaysia is because we started a pilot program, and what we love to do is before we actually publicize anything, is we try to get something done. I always think there's a great deal of people talking first and then forgetting to do later. We like to do things first and then talk about it later. So we had this pilot project with UNHCR, and it involved in the Klang Valley, which is just outside Kuala Lumpur, the capital of Malaysia, a number of children, boys and girls. And they were very suspicious of anything that looked like it was something to do with the government. They were very suspicious of anything that looked like it was authority. They didn't want to come to school. They refused to come to school. So none of the children would come to school. So then they brought in the Asian Football Confederation, and we started with the English Premier League, another one of our partners. We started football training twice a week. And gradually, the children started to come. They wanted, first, they didn't come in the school. They looked over the fence. What's going on here? And, you know, oh, they're playing football. And by the end of the first pilot project, 99.99% of the children had come to school, boys and girls, to play, because they wouldn't have come if there wasn't football, if there wasn't the sport. So what it did, we're not saying that it didn't produce anything other than a doorway to education. But there was still one boy who wouldn't come. There was still one boy who wouldn't come. He was not coming. He refused to come to school. And he said, "I'm a good footballer anyway. You need me more than I need the school." So we said, "Fine." And then the school team played the first ever match. They were all dressed. We got sponsored kit. They all had England football kit on, which normally guarantees you're going to lose. But on this occasion, they managed to win. They all had England football kit on. We managed to get a local sponsor to provide them all with football boots. They'd never had football boots before. When they were handed over the football boots, they were crying and they were kissing the boots and they were lying on the floor, hugging these boots. They were their prized possession. The little boy who had never come to school suddenly walked through the gates and said, "I think I'd like to come to school now." And we said, "Okay, you come for first month, and then we'll see if you can play for the football team." He's now got a trial with one of Malaysia's professional football clubs. And so it goes to show, again, all football was a conduit to education. All football is in these areas is a conduit to health and to other forms of well-being. So you can get people to come to. We've rebuilt a school in Nepal, and why did we rebuild a school in Nepal? Well, the earthquake struck. It was massive in 2015. You may remember one of the epicenters was a place called Sindapalchek. And you saw the pictures there of rebuilding the school. When the earthquake struck, there were 22,000 people living in Sindapalchek. The day after the earthquake, there were less than 2,000 people living in Sindapalchek. The rest of them had either been killed or displaced. What we managed to do by rebuilding the school and putting a football pitch in the middle, we got people to start moving back to the village. Now there are nearly 10,000 people back in there. All we did, using our members, who are our stakeholders, and they supply a lot of our funding. But by smart partnerships with the Ministry of Education in Nepal, which helped us cut through a lot of the red tape, by smart partnerships with the International Red Cross, we managed to rebuild and to re-energize a community. And that's just two of the little stories that we have. But we could go on and on and on about helping a lot of the refugees in the West. But it goes back to things that people have already said. Smart partnerships with good partners, good business plans, clear and efficient funding, and making sure that when you say you're going to deliver a project, you deliver it.
Thank you. Please clap for Colin. I hope you are noting down your questions, because I'm going to be giving you the opportunity to ask them very soon. So note them down. So next we have Liz, who is going to talk about, at least from my perspective, a very unique collective impact initiative in Australia. So with that.
I can't click, Anne. I got to be coordinated. Clearly not a football player. Right. Okay. Oh, I went too far. Yeah, okay, no. All right. Good morning, everyone, and I'm just really delighted to be here. I think there's nothing better than getting together with the community of United Way and partners who are here to do good and change the world. I can't think of a better way to spend anyone's time. So thank you so much, and a particular thank you to Secretary General Kim and Dr. Ye and the United Way worldwide leaders on behalf of Australia. We do really relish these opportunities and your really warm hospitality, so thank you. So look, I'm here to talk about Australia, and I thought I'd just give you a little snapshot of Australia, because you might have an impression of it as sort of a richly multicultural society with lots of opportunity, and it is all of that. But like every developed society, we have an increasingly widening gulf. With 13% of Australians living below the internationally accepted poverty line, and most importantly, I think for this discussion, 17% of all Australian children living in poverty, and youth unemployment of 15 to 24-year-olds being double the national average, and of course our statistics on our Indigenous population is not something to be proud of. So United Way, I joined United Way because I had a very firm belief that the only way to alleviate some of these issues is to really bring together sectors and have cross-sector partnerships that will make a difference. In our country, I think social service is quite siloed, and despite the large amount of money that is invested, we're not getting the outcomes at a population level that you would hope to see. So at United Way, we've tried to focus on really place-based initiatives that are linked to communities that can bring change. We decided to really focus on young people and on children as the areas where we felt we could make the most difference, particularly in early intervention and early literacy work. And we wanted to be that organisation that could bring best practice in business community partnerships and really involve business in that social change. Most particularly, the unique project that was referred to by Janet is one that seemed to fit our DNA as a collaborative organisation, and it started as a true collective impact project called the Hive at Mount Druitt. Mount Druitt in Sydney is a notoriously disadvantaged community. You may have similar in your country. It was disadvantaged when I was a child, so I felt very strongly about this project that, 20 years on, no, only joking, 40 years on, this was still a disadvantaged, community that had, despite, I'm sure, best efforts by not-for-profits and government, hadn't been able to bring itself out of this reputation of being disadvantaged. In fact, people don't put their Mount Druitt postcode on job applications because it has this reputation. So, with excellent funding from a foundation and support from Family and Community Services, which is part of our New South Wales government, United Way partnered with those organisations to look at a collective impact project in this community that would address those issues and try to lift the community to where it should be. The reality of applying the Harvard model is something quite different. So I wanted to talk you through how we've actually gone about it over the 3 years, because as I said, this work's an art. It really is not a science that you can put an academic framework around, but that's wonderful guidance and a wonderful framework within which to work. So the way we went about this was to first of all galvanise the community voice. As I said, I think change cannot happen in communities of deep disadvantage unless the community is very much engaged in what it is they want to change in their own community. Otherwise, you completely disempower them. So we did quite extensive community conversations where we invited stakeholders from the community, We had the police there, we had not-for-profits, we had community leaders, and we had some really great local community people who really wanted to see, they were proud of Mount Druitt, they wanted to see Mount Druitt succeed. So we held these community conversations called the Swarm, and out of that swarm, we identified the issue that the community wanted to really address. And this was, the decision was made that the community wanted to ensure that all children in Mount Druitt start school well. And the reason behind that was, to my I must say, distress, in some of the suburbs in Mount Druitt, 1 in 22 children were getting a preschool education. So you can imagine when they arrived on the doorstep of the state school, they really were not ready, and the state system, as good as it might be, was not ready to receive children who hadn't had their health checks, hadn't had their literacy and vocabulary level that would allow them to succeed in school and then ultimately succeed in life. So whilst we didn't impose that goal on the community, to be honest, we were very happy at United Way that that was a chosen area for focus, because we were quite experienced in that area, and it was something that we knew from our own deep research at United Way was the early intervention that's required for children to succeed ultimately in life. And the research is very, very clear on that from 0 to 5, if you haven't had a solid start to your education in that period, and readiness for school and literacy and books and play groups and socialisation and other health checks, then you will not catch up. Pretty much you can determine where you're going to be at 30. So it was very interesting to us that the community innately knew this and chose this issue. So we embarked on that project with that goal. In the middle is how we as United Way, the backbone, organised ourselves. And really critical to that backbone function is that you're a facilitator. You just cannot do this alone. The task is too great. So we were a facilitator, a galvaniser, a coordinator. And the way we did that was to put together a local leadership team, which was on the ground people from not-for-profits, our government representatives who are essential to this project, and some business leader to talk and work out the projects that needed to be achieved at that local level. And the ambassador group was a semi-governing group that was what I'd call the top-down group. So we had this very strong bottom-up from the community and then top-down from the ambassadors. And I chair that group. And our role really, I think they drew me there kicking down the door. If only I'd been able to do that that effectively. But it was to symbolise that we were there to try and remove any high-level barriers at a governmental level and advocacy level, and we worked to do that. So that was a coordinating body at the community level. And the way the work has proceeded, which we've found very effective, is to work both at a suburb level, which there are 8 different suburbs in the postcode, and to work across the postcode on certain thematic projects such as raising the level of preschool quality, for example. Incredibly and unfairly in these suburbs, preschool quality is not as high as what my children would experience. So raising that level, bringing in the partners who we can work with from the universities and from high-performing childcare groups to raise the level of childcare and preschool commitment. And the suburb work is what has been a great learning, I must say, for me, and we call it the ultra-local work. This is the ultra-local work that our people on the ground do with the partners to connect families. These are isolated families. They don't know how to engage with the services that are on the ground, to start to build that community infrastructure, that community social capital, that community connection to make this a sustainable project. And that suburb work we've found has been really critical. So we work deeply in 2 or 3 suburbs now. Our aim is to be quite deep across the whole 8 suburbs that make up Mount Druitt. So essentially, it's about deep engagement with the unusual suspects, having a bit of top-down, but making sure that this is really about bottom-up and representing the community voice and the needs. The results, you know, I'm sure someone will ask me that question eventually. The results, some of them are hard to measure because systems are actually hard to measure. How do you measure that you are achieving cultural change in a suburb? To some extent, it's a feeling. But I think what we're very positive about is that already in that suburb of 1 in 22, we've moved to 6 to 7 in 22 children are engaging with preschool. We have 1,000 children that are engaging across the postcode with our partners and with the Hive. And that means that we're reaching the families and beginning to give them the connections they need, all with this common goal of children in 2770 starting school well. So that's the Hive at Mount Druitt, and of course we're very happy to share any more information through our local worker Danny, who actually is far more informed on this than me, and she will have a lot more detail. The other project, just very quickly, I will touch on, which is another form of collaborative, collective work that we do, and it's a different type of area, but I think equally compelling, is in Macquarie Business Park. And this is our way of wanting to really bring business and community to a connected place, and to ensure that businesses are not working separately to the community in which they live. Macquarie Park is a business park with many corporates and their head offices there. And this was a collective project that was started with a couple of CEOs who said, we really want to connect we want to know what's going on in our backyard. How can we help our local community? And United Way was really able to broker that connection and bring it together. And so we now have in that business park 8 CEOs who are on our steering committee, and we have connected them with the local community, which actually has a high need in early literacy and a high immigrant population. So it's actually been an incredible win-win. The goal of the project was that young people reach their potential, and that meant for our partners that children enter school ready to learn and young people leave school ready to succeed. Some of the United Way people will remember Read, Learn, Succeed. Our corporate partners really love that, and we're very convinced about it. Through those partnerships, we now have 500 enrolments in our Imagination Library, which is the early literacy work. But what's most important about that is beyond being a book program that the corporate partners have sponsored, we're able to provide the wraparound services through our community partners, childcare centres, not-for-profits, and others in this Macquarie Park area that allow connections to build between people who otherwise didn't know how to get services, weren't connected into community. And secondly, for the high school students, we've been able to connect them into our corporate partners to have visits to their corporate headquarters to know what finance, HR, other business groups might be of interest to them, as well as to have our corporate partners help them with mock interviews and CV preparation. So it's another form of a truly collaborative partnership between our business partners and our community partners that we coordinate as a backbone, not quite in the Harvard sense of collective impact, but it's been immensely successful, and we really hope to replicate that in a couple of other sites in Australia. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope that was helpful.
Please clap for Liz. You know, when we think about community or collective impact, it really is about bringing together civil society, what I call the for-profit world, business, corporates, and so on. And the element that many of us often forget is government, and how important it is, particularly at the local level, to involve governments in the work that we do, not only for support, but for long-term sustainability. Because ultimately, it is probably a government agency that will see this initiative through once it is implemented and proven. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Sachiko, who is going to talk about, you know, when we talk about our impact work, we can't do nothing, as we say, without money. And so she's going to talk about what was a very unique opportunity working with or from funding from Ralph Lauren and some work that has happened and is going on in Japan. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much for giving me the floor. Just as a brief introduction, I come from an organization called Japan Center for International Exchange. We call it JCIE for short. It's an independent nonprofit organization pioneering and promoting Japan's active engagement in the international community. We have actually 4 pillars of activities: policy, research and dialogue, political exchange, global health and global issues, and strengthening the civil society. It really spans a whole diverse range of fields, but under the 4th pillar, we have been facilitating a lot of philanthropic programs, as you can see some of the figures here. And it's under this pillar that we have been involved with the work from the United Way. So, okay, when the March 11th, 2011, there was this great East Japan earthquake and tsunami, as all of you must have heard. Polo Ralph Lauren came straight away and made special polo shirts and sold them. And with their multi-million-dollar donation, they gave the funds to support the psychological well-being of the survivors of the disaster and to help them rebuild their communities. The donation was entrusted to the United Way, which sent the funds to the Central Community Chest of Japan. But as you can imagine, Central Community of Japan had its hands full with so many different disaster-related projects. Our organization, JCIE, stepped in to help find the grantees and also to serve as an intermediary, as many Japanese organizations do not speak English. So, what was very unique about this grant is that it was a huge donation, but we split it up into smaller portions given over a span of 6 years. This is very important because none of the organizations were large enough to be able to absorb large donations at once. And disaster recovery efforts are very long-lasting, so they needed to have that long-lasting support. And it was also very special in that there was a flexibility. We were able to use the funds mainly to support coordinators, the personnel cost, which was the missing link in getting things done in the disaster zone. The first the grantee had set up a volunteer center to coordinate volunteer activities and help the people in the communities. The second one was offering one-on-one counseling through a system of personal supporters. This was a service much in need but not available at the time in this region. And a third one had set up a safe space for children and students. We're really going through a traumatic session at this time through a tutoring service. And a fourth one that's not listed here served as our coordinator on the ground because this was a very hard and very rapidly changing environment that we needed to know what the changing needs were. So, moving on. All of them played a very important role in their communities, becoming models of a lot of the services provided and the programs introduced to the region. But one of the big spin-off that we wanted to highlight today was a new social business model that was started by one of the grantees, the Kamaishi Social Welfare Council. It was called the Gojoru Initiative, and Gojoru sort of literally translates to something like mutual support, trying to mutually support each other. So what was happening was that in this region, they could use the long-term support to offer regular and more frequent visits to individual households by the social workers. And this, like Liz mentioned, it was very important for them to be able to listen to people, to be by their side, and help them get back on their feet. However, during the process, they found a lot of the older men who were becoming reclusive, people who have lost a sense of life, a purpose in life, having lost jobs, having lost their families. And there were others also through a number of issues having difficulty finding employment. So to address this issue, the Gojoru project was set up to create jobs. And this was done through using the network that was nurtured over the recovery efforts throughout the years, reaching out to the local forestry association and local industry. And this is about talking like what Jose was saying. It's not that we don't have the resources. It was there in the beginning. If you look around, there was all this network. And also the particular locality that we were funding was 90% covered with forests. And they had suffered a major fire forest just last spring. So there were a lot of wood sitting around with burned surface that could not be sold, which will be an extra job for the regular forestry workers, but an opportunity for these people who were just becoming reclusive. So with seed money provided with the flexibility of the grant, we were able to provide the seed money for the Social Welfare Council to start up this project, get some tools, hire initially 8 people, senior citizens and disabled people, to do this job. And eventually, hopefully, they will be also trained to produce wood pellets out of the forest resource and make it into a sustainable income-generating project, which in the long run, hopefully, it's a very small-scale project, but we'll be able to annually recruit and hire new people as the initial ones get off on their feet. So just to very rapidly run through some of the other impacts we have had, we have here sort of an involvement of the government sector too, because the one-on-one counseling system had become a model, and the government saw that there was this need for counseling services. And so there was a legal mandate that was issued in 2015, 4 years after the disaster, that finally was put in place, requiring all localities to have this kind of a similar counseling service. And this same group also set up a special disaster response network so that all these social workers who have had experience working with the disaster survivors have put up a network that when there's a need and there's a call, they would be dispatched quickly to disaster areas. And they have already been on a call several times addressing flooding disasters that occurred in the region. And another organization had developed an empowerment approach. This is having the students realize their own potential, be able to solve problems, address their own problems, and empower themselves. And a spin-off of that is that a lot of the students who had gone through the tutoring programs are now coming back as volunteer teachers and tutors to teach the younger students. They had gone through the trauma as a junior high school and senior high school students, and now they're coming back, and actually one of the organization is hiring a staff that is a former graduate of having been involved in this tutoring program. So all in all, having very rapidly gone through it, I just want to wrap up that they have all moved on from being helped to being able to help others, and that's something we can be very proud of. They share their experiences and know-how, and hopefully that is going to be scaled out and help others. Thank you.
Thank you. Please clap for Sachiko. Just one thing that that you talked about that I thought was very interesting is, well, two things related to your funding, that it had a 6-year horizon, which is unusual, and there was an element of flexibility in the funding to enable you to kind of go with the needs of the community and not feel, kind of locked in. So it's very interesting. We have, I believe, 10 minutes. Okay, thank you. So I would like to open it up for questions. I invite panelists to ask questions of each other and also invite the audience to also ask questions. So who's first? Aaron.
Thank you. So I had a question actually for you, Colin. So I wanted to share that yesterday we had Samsung on one of the panels, and the moderator, our colleague Ming, asked an interesting question, which is, what does Samsung look for in its community partners? And in your presentation today, you referenced the importance of good partnerships. So I wanted to ask you the same question. That's the first one. And the second one I wanted to ask is how you fund this work. You talked about who's funding it, and I'm curious as to whether or not it's a requirement or a voluntary support of those who are involved in the effort to say how much and to what of any of the areas that you listed. There's 5. So those are my 2 questions.
Aaron is always good at managing to get 2 questions into one. You probably noticed as he started today. Going back on the what's a good partner? What is a good partner? It's interesting. It depends on where you are in the world. Sometimes it's from the world of the industrial world. Sometimes we get lots of support, particularly in developed countries, particularly in places like Japan, Korea Republic, China. We get a lot of support from the industrial and commercial entities. With those, you're looking. Most of the ones who come to you are blue chip companies. And what you cannot do, I don't think, is take a risk. Because any project that you do, if you take a risk with a project by engaging with a partner that you're not aware of or not confident of, then that project could be fundamentally flawed before you start. If you go to other parts of the world, other parts of Asia where we operate, I think that the government, and I think Janet mentioned the government, and I know Liz mentioned the government, are key to making things happen. The red tape that when we tried to make things happen in Nepal after the earthquake, everybody wanted to do something and nobody could do anything. It was wrapped up in so much red tape that you couldn't see the country for red. And so therefore you had to find the right partner to cut through that red tape. The same happens in other countries like China, for example. People's Republic of China, you need the government support. If you haven't got government support, it's quite difficult sometimes to deliver projects. And what we also find is that one of our other partners is our local football associations, because they can open doors with their own government. They deal with their governments on a day-to-day basis. So, for example, Lebanon was an interesting one. The Syrian crisis we're all very aware of. But what also happens in countries when you have a crisis is that you also have a local crisis, is that sometimes the local population is saying, hey, why are all these people getting this money and why are we not getting the money? So therefore, what you have to do is bring on board the local government, and we did that through in fact, on my social responsibility committee is actually the mayor of the second biggest city in, not Beirut, the second biggest city in Lebanon. And he was able to go to the mayor of Beirut, who was then able to go to the government and open up the doorways so that this project could take place. So there's no easy answer to what is the best project, what is the best partner, but there are several partners. Funding is a very interesting question. That's the second part of the first question. The funding, at the moment, the Asian Football Confederation is a new body. We've been in operation for 64 years, but we're still a new body in terms of commercial development. We're probably only now entering our real commercial exploitation. People say, oh, football, it's the richest sport on the planet. You should just be able to fund it yourselves. And in a lot of ways, we do. Our member associations make donations to to humanitarian aid. For example, Australia is a big benefactor, Japan, Korea Republic, all big donors in those areas. But we also generate money ourselves, and we do that at the moment through our Champions League final. We have a Champions League competition, which I think Suwon of Korea Republic are about to qualify for the Eastern final. They won 3-0 against John Bok the other day. I hope you're not a John Bok or a supporter, but they won 3-0. So, and if your team gets to the final, 5% of the 5% of your prize money and 5% of the gate revenues comes to social responsibility. One of our sister confederations, UEFA, much more developed than we are, take all disciplinary fines, and in the next commercial cycle, we'll do that. So we'll be the only people cheering when somebody gets a yellow or red card, because we'll be making money out of it, because the fines will come to us. But I think one other point, so I hope that answers the question, but one point I think was very important that Sachiko just said was, there's a great saying, never give a man a fish, teach him how to fish. And I think that is such an important thing that you've been doing, because we find that we go into these camps, and what we do is we don't put on a football game, we teach them how to coach football. We teach them how to administer football. We teach them how to, and with that, and you tend to find, particularly with young boys, if you ask a young boy to add up some numbers, he'll say, oh, I don't know. If you ask him to add up football scores, he'll do it. So, a long answer to your two questions.
Thank you. Questions?
Hi, yeah, this is a question kind of aimed at the whole panel, but a little bit more towards Liz. With collective impact, there are obviously quite a few partners involved. And how do you meet the expectations and goals of every party involved? So obviously you have a collective interest to advance the common good, but often if you've got the government involved, for example, they have various guidelines to meet with policy. So how do you make sure that everyone is kind of getting what they want out of the initiative?
Yes, it's definitely one of the major challenges. So I think you have to just be very clear about what the goals are and what each of those stakeholders is bringing to the organisation and want out of it, and that's where the strong backbone comes in. But I would have to say, in putting together your backbone, you have to have people with very strong soft skills and very good project management skills to be able to manage that many stakeholders. And additionally, I would say many people want to be involved and jump on board these initiatives. And I think in terms of this question of partnerships and who's involved, eventually not everyone can be on the bus in a way. Sometimes there are people who really just are not buying into the agenda. You spend a lot of time with them and you can't ever satisfy their needs. Do you know what I mean? So I'd say this is the art of it, the give and take, the desire of everyone to keep that northern star of the community and what your goal is for the children in that community and the community aspiration as a whole. And that's why these projects take time, because you need to find the right people to be with you on that journey. We've been very fortunate on the government front that we've had two or three fantastic workers in that community who've facilitated a lot of connections for us and overcome departmental red tape and so on. They're the sort of people you have to be side by side within these projects and find your community people who keep speaking up into that project. So I hope that helps. There isn't one real answer, but it's a lot of work. Yeah.
All right, I have 1 minute. Any more questions? I know we're standing between you and lunch. Okay. So first of all, I'd like to invite you to please clap for our esteemed panelists. We experienced 4 or actually 5 very different examples of collective impact. I hope that there was a gem that you were able to pick up from at least one. Yesterday in his keynote address, the Honorable Ban Ki-moon talked about leveraging the power of partnership. And he said that there's not a single individual, no matter who they may be, who can do it alone. So thank you for your kind attention.